The first time I realized my parents didn't see me as family was during a celebration I helped organize. Their smiles were wide, their speeches perfect, but as I looked around, I noticed something chilling. Every compliment, every toast, carefully avoided mentioning me. My brother, lazy and careless, received all the praise. All I got was a polite nod and a thanks for your help. I froze, a cold realization settling in my chest. Years of late nights, of fixing mistakes no one else noticed, of carrying their business on my back. And this was my reward? A polite nod and a shadow in the corner. It hit me like a punch. They had never truly valued me. Not really. The next months were a blur of small betrayals I hadn't noticed before. Contracts lost that I had painstakingly secured, meetings where I was ignored, decisions made behind my back that sabotaged everything I worked for. And always my parents' excuse, "We're doing what's best for the family." For the family, meaning my brother. Then came the day I was officially replaced. They called me into the office, that familiar room that had once felt like home. "We've decided to restructure the company," they said with rehearsed calm. "You'll be stepping down immediately. It's nothing personal." Nothing personal. I laughed, but it was hollow. My hands were shaking, my chest tight. After all those years, after everything I had given, they tossed me aside like an old document no one wanted to read. I left that office with my head held high, though inside I was anything but. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just walked. And in that silence, a single thought took root. If I couldn't be part of the family, I would become the one who controls it. Years later, I did. And what followed? Well, they still don't understand what happened. They don't see the strings I pulled, the subtle moves I made while they slept comfortably, thinking their empire was safe. And now, every time they look at me, I see a flicker of fear, a recognition that the world they thought they controlled is slipping through their fingers. After leaving my parents' office, I felt the strangest mixture of emptiness and clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't tied to their expectations, their whims, or their endless criticisms. I was free, but that freedom didn't feel like liberation. It felt like a challenge. To survive without them, to prove that my worth wasn't something they could define. I moved into a small apartment in a part of town I'd always avoided, the kind of place that smelled faintly of rain and old asphalt. It was modest, nothing like the polished halls of my parents' business empire, but it was mine. And for the first few weeks, I sank into the quiet, trying not to think about the life I had lost. Every night, though, I scrolled through spreadsheets and memos in my mind, replaying the deals, the mistakes, and the moments they had chosen to overlook me. Work was hard. Freelance consulting, small contracts, anything I could get to pay the bills. And yet, even in the chaos of trying to survive, a spark of satisfaction grew. I began networking with old contacts I had once been told were not ready for me. Slowly, carefully, I started building a foundation, one that had nothing to do with family loyalty and everything to do with skill, strategy, and intelligence. Months passed, and my efforts began to bear fruit. Clients who had once been hesitant now trusted me, impressed by the meticulous attention to detail I brought. I realized something I hadn't acknowledged before. I had learned more from my parents than I had ever admitted. Not just business, but psychology, negotiation, and the art of reading people. Every slight, every dismissal, had been a lesson in patience and cunning. Meanwhile, I watched my parents' company from a distance. At first, it thrived without me, or at least it seemed that way on the surface. My brother struggled to keep up with the workload, making small errors that the clients tolerated. But underneath, cracks were forming. The foundation they thought was solid, the one I had helped build, was slowly weakening. And as much as I tried to push the thought away, I felt a strange, almost guilty satisfaction at noticing it. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I received an email that made my heart skip a beat. A former client, one that had been dissatisfied under my parents' management, now seeking a new long-term partnership. They asked me directly if I could take on their account. In that moment, I realized something profound. The tables were slowly turning, whether they knew it or not. And I knew, deep down, that when the time came, I could either rebuild their trust or watch everything crumble from the inside. By the time I signed the first major client under my own name, I had been away from my parents' office for nearly 2 years. It wasn't just about the money or the contracts. It was a validation of everything I had sacrificed. Every late night, every argument ignored, every dismissal now felt worth it. I was proving, first to myself, that I was capable of more than they had ever allowed me to be. But success wasn't enough. Watching their company struggle from afar became a dark obsession. I noticed every inefficiency, every mismanaged account, every instance where my brother's laziness undermined months of hard work I had put in. And I realized that the people who had once laughed at me, who had told me I was too serious or too meticulous, were vulnerable. It started with subtle moves. I reached out to former employees who had left my parents' company, offering consulting opportunities that allowed them to keep their skills sharp while staying in touch with me. I knew these were people my parents trusted implicitly. Slowly, I began to gather allies without them realizing it. An invisible network of support that could tip the scales when the moment came. The first real test came unexpectedly. A major supplier, one critical to my parents' operations, contacted me directly. They were frustrated, saying that my parents' company had become disorganized, late on payments, and increasingly difficult to deal with. They asked if I could help them streamline things, under my guidance. I hesitated. This was my first opportunity to intervene directly in their world. It would be easy to sabotage, easy to push them further toward collapse. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I offered discreet advice, small suggestions that improved efficiency just enough to keep the supplier calm. I wanted them to feel safe, to think they were still in control, even as I started to pull the strings behind the scenes. Meanwhile, my brother continued to stumble. Promotions that should have gone to capable employees were mismanaged. Key clients were ignored, and rumors of financial missteps started surfacing. My parents, still blinded by favoritism, refused to see the writing on the wall. They still believed they were untouchable. I often imagined their faces if they knew what I had become, how much I had learned, how quietly powerful I had grown. But for now, I remained patient. Revenge was a slow game, and I was willing to wait. Every move had to be calculated, every relationship nurtured, every weakness recorded. And deep down, I couldn't deny it. The thought of reclaiming what was rightfully mine, the recognition, the respect, the legacy I had helped build, gave me a thrill I hadn't felt in years. Little did they know the storm was coming. It started subtly. A missed deadline here, a forgotten meeting there. At first, my parents brushed it off. "It's a busy season," they'd say. My brother shrugged, claiming he was handling it all. But the cracks in their empire were widening, and I watched with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. I received an unexpected phone call one evening from a longtime client. Their voice was strained, tight with frustration. "We need someone to take charge," they said. "Your parents' company isn't delivering, and we can't keep losing money." I knew this was my opening. Not to destroy, not yet, but to step in subtly, as the capable force they had overlooked for so long. I offered assistance, suggesting solutions that only someone with intimate knowledge of their operations could provide. The client was relieved, thanking me repeatedly, unaware that I was the very person my parents had discarded. Meanwhile, my parents' office became a war zone of blame and tension. Meetings were filled with shouting, doors slammed, and frantic attempts to cover mistakes my brother had made. My mother, usually composed, now looked weary, her eyes darting nervously when discussing finances. My father, who once exuded control, snapped at employees for minor oversights, a brittle anger replacing his usual confidence. I didn't intervene openly. I couldn't afford to, but I kept meticulous notes, tracking every failed decision, every mismanaged account. It was like watching a slow-motion collapse, and with each mistake, I felt a gnawing mix of guilt and vindication. Could I have done something sooner? Perhaps. But this was their choice, to ignore me, to favor incompetence over dedication. Then came the first confrontation. My brother, sensing something shifting, called me out during a casual family dinner. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he sneered, eyes blazing. "You left. You abandoned this family, and now you're trying to play God?" I froze, then laughed softly. "Play God?" I asked. "No. I just learned what I was capable of, something you'll never understand." My parents exchanged worried glances, but didn't intervene. The tension was palpable. That night, I left the dinner early, walking through the empty streets, thinking about the power I had quietly amassed. I realized, for the first time, how dangerous knowledge could be in the hands of someone who was patient, strategic, and underestimated. And I knew, without a doubt, that the moment to make a decisive move was approaching. I never imagined it would feel like this. The first real blow to my parents' company didn't come from anger or spite. It came from precision, patience, and a little knowledge. I had waited, watched, and mapped out every vulnerability, every overlooked detail, every weak link that could unravel their empire. It started with a single account, one my parents had taken for granted. The client had complained about delays, errors, and broken promises, but my brother had ignored the warnings. I approached them under the guise of an independent consultant, someone who could help them sort things out. They didn't know it was me, and that was perfect. I didn't sabotage immediately. That would have been reckless. Instead, I offered solutions that subtly diverted resources away from my parents' company. Advice that seemed innocuous but created small inefficiencies in their workflow. Payments were delayed, shipments misrouted, and communication breakdowns began to pile up. The chaos was slow, almost invisible, but I knew it would compound over weeks. Then came the first confrontation with my parents, though they didn't know it yet. They called me under the pretense of discussing a potential partnership. I sat in the conference room, listening to their complaints about failing clients and declining sales, a strange weight pressing in my chest. They spoke of loyalty, hard work, and family values, all concepts they had ignored when they fired me. I wanted to say something, to remind them of my years of dedication, but I didn't. I smiled politely, nodding as they vented, careful to keep my expression neutral. Inside, though, I felt a rush, a mix of triumph and unease. Was this revenge, or was it simply justice? The first tangible result came a week later. An important client, frustrated and disillusioned, switched entirely to my consultancy. Suddenly, the board meetings my parents held were filled with whispers, panic, and finger-pointing. My brother was furious, unable to understand how someone outside the family could swoop in and claim what he had taken for granted. And that's when it hit me. Power isn't about shouting or making threats. Power is quiet, calculated, and often invisible until it's too late. I wasn't just reclaiming recognition. I was reshaping the world they had built without me, one small, deliberate move at a time. Yet, even as I watched the cracks widen, I couldn't completely escape the unease in my chest. Were my actions cruel? Or were they merely balancing the scales that had been so unfairly tipped against me for so long? Either way, the game had begun. And from this point, there was no turning back. By now, the cracks in my parents' empire were no longer subtle. They were impossible to ignore. Every missed deadline, every angry client, every financial discrepancy screamed louder than any confrontation ever could. My parents were frantic. Their carefully curated image of control was unraveling, and I watched from the shadows, both fascinated and disturbed by the unfolding chaos. My brother was the first to break. He stormed into the office one afternoon, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. "This is a disaster. Why is everything falling apart?" he shouted, glaring at my mother and father, but their usual calm, their usual control was gone. My mother sat frozen, her hands trembling, while my father's face reddened with frustration, words choking in his throat. The irony wasn't lost on me. All those years, they had praised my brother for doing nothing and belittled me for striving, for caring too much. And now, his incompetence was dragging them under. My heart ached with a strange cocktail of satisfaction and guilt. I had never wanted them to fail. Yet the pattern of their own choices was impossible to ignore. I stayed silent, quietly analyzing every move, every reaction. My network of former employees and allies, subtly guided by me, was beginning to tip the scales further. Clients were quietly shifting loyalty, partners were reconsidering agreements, and the board was starting to murmur behind closed doors. And then came my moral reckoning. Sitting alone in my apartment that night, I couldn't help but question myself. Was this justice? Or had I become the very kind of manipulative force I despised in my parents' business world? Every successful move brought a pang of doubt. I was reclaiming what I had lost. But at what cost? Still, I reminded myself of the years I had sacrificed, the doors that were slammed in my face, the opportunities one had been denied simply for wanting to be treated fairly. This was more than revenge, it was recognition, it was correction, it was survival. The next morning, news broke. A critical supplier had pulled back from my parents' company entirely, citing mismanagement and poor communication. Panic spread like wildfire. My brother yelled, my parents argued, and I, as always, remained unseen, my influence silent but undeniable. And yet, with every ripple of chaos I had sent through their lives, a tiny voice whispered in the back of my mind, how far will this go? How much more can I control before I lose myself in the process? One thing was certain. The storm had only just begun. It was a Monday morning, the kind that feels heavier than any day before. I walked past my parents' office on a business errand, the weight of everything I had orchestrated pressing against my chest. I wasn't planning to confront them, yet fate, it seemed, had other ideas. The conference room door was open, and inside, my parents and brother were mid-argument. My brother's voice cracked with desperation. This is all your fault. None of this would have happened if you just... He stopped short as he noticed me standing silently in the doorway. Shock froze them. My mother's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. My father's jaw tightened, a mix of anger and disbelief flashing across his face. What are you doing here? He demanded. I stepped into the room slowly, letting the silence stretch between us like a living thing. I came to see how things are going, I said calmly. Judging by the panic, I'd say not well. My brother's face turned red, a mixture of fury and fear. You've been behind all of this, haven't you? His words stumbled out, accusing and terrified at the same time. I haven't done anything you wouldn't have done yourselves, I replied. I've just used what I know. I've seen the cracks you ignored, and I've watched you stumble into them. My parents exchanged glances. My mother's voice shook. We thought you abandoned us. You left without a word. And now you left. I interrupted softly. I left because I was forced out, because my dedication was ignored, because every mistake my brother made was tolerated while I was dismissed. The room went silent. My father's face twisted in anger and disbelief. My brother fumed, and my mother's eyes glistened with tears. You've ruined everything, my father finally shouted. I shook my head. I haven't ruined anything. You've done that yourselves. I've just revealed the truth of your choices. And now you have to face the consequences. For a moment, the room felt suspended in time. My brother's fury burned like fire. My parents' control crumbled like fragile glass. And I, standing in the middle of it all, felt a shiver of both triumph and unease. And then came the hardest part. Looking at my family, the people who raised me, and realizing that love, loyalty, and justice were no longer simple concepts. They were tangled with pride, betrayal, and the unrelenting consequences of years of neglect and favoritism. I left the office that day with a heavy heart. I had struck the first major blow, but in doing so, I had crossed a line I couldn't return from. The storm wasn't just outside. It was inside me, too, raging silently with every step I took. The days following the confrontation were brutal. News of the company's failures, minor at first, began to leak. Clients whispered about mismanagement, suppliers pulled back, and key employees started considering leaving. My parents, who had once held themselves above scrutiny, were now scrambling to contain damage they hadn't foreseen. My brother, furious and humiliated, refused to talk to me. Every interaction was laced with venom, a constant reminder of how his incompetence had collided with my silent strategy. I could see him crumbling under pressure, and part of me wanted to reach out, to offer guidance. But another, sharper part relished watching the consequences of his laziness unfold. Meanwhile, my parents oscillated between pleading and blaming. My mother's guilt surfaced in quiet, tearful conversations, while my father's pride prevented him from admitting any mistake. Every call, every meeting, was a battlefield of recriminations and strained politeness. It pained me to watch them suffer, and yet I couldn't step in. Their world, once untouchable, was now fragile, and I had helped shape that fragility. I began receiving messages from former employees I had discreetly kept close. They updated me on meetings, on decisions my parents were botching, on the growing panic within the company. It was fascinating and frightening how quickly things unraveled when careful attention was removed. I realized that my influence, though subtle, had become undeniable. Still, late at night, the doubt returned. I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the city lights and wondering how far I had gone. Had I crossed the line from justice to cruelty? Every small victory was tainted with unease. I had wanted recognition, respect, and fairness, but the collateral damage was immense. Employees were stressed, loyal clients were confused, and my family was fracturing in ways I had never imagined. One evening, a call from a longtime client forced me to confront the reality of my actions. "You've saved our account," they said, "but your parents are spiraling. Are you sure you want this?" I swallowed hard. Yes, I had helped stabilize things externally, but internally the chaos was now irreversible. And in that quiet moment, I realized something essential. Power comes at a cost. Every strategic move, every calculated step forward, demanded a price. Not just in the world I was reshaping, but in my own conscience. I had initiated a storm, and now I had to live in it, alongside the people I once called family. The question no longer was whether I could win, it was whether I could survive the consequences of winning. It happened faster than anyone expected. One by one, major clients pulled away, citing mismanagement and unreliability. Suppliers threatened to sever contracts, and the board of directors held emergency meetings that ended in shouting matches. My parents' company, the empire I had helped build, was teetering on the edge of collapse. My parents were exhausted, their pride shattered. My father's face, usually stern and unwavering, now carried the weight of panic and disbelief. My mother, always the emotional anchor, looked hollow, consumed by guilt she couldn't articulate. And my brother, he had become a ghost of the careless, arrogant man he once was. Fear had replaced his smug confidence. I watched from the sidelines, my hands clean yet stained with the invisible influence I had wielded. Every move I had made, every client I had redirected, every subtle disruption I had engineered, had brought us to this point. And yet, as the chaos reached its peak, I couldn't shake a gnawing question. Had I gone too far? Late one night, I found myself standing in the empty office that had once been my playground, my battleground, my home. The walls seemed smaller, the air heavier. I realized that this wasn't just about business anymore. It was about family, about trust, about the people I loved and the people who had once betrayed me. My brother finally confronted me, his voice breaking under the weight of desperation. "Why are you doing this? Why ruin everything?" I took a deep breath. "I didn't ruin it. You did. I just revealed the truth. You can't pretend incompetence doesn't have consequences." He glared at me, tears in his eyes. "You've changed. You're not the person we knew. You're cold." His words cut deeper than any financial loss or professional victory ever could. I wanted to defend myself, to say I was just righting a wrong, but the reality was more complicated. I had won, yes, but at what cost? Pride, family, trust. Those things didn't come with spreadsheets or contracts. The final blow came quietly. My parents, exhausted and defeated, realized that without drastic intervention, the company would collapse completely. They reached out to me, not as the child they had dismissed, but as the strategist they had underestimated. Sitting across from them, I felt a strange mix of triumph sorrow, and dread. I had the power now, the control, but with it came the ultimate question. Could I wield it without destroying everything I had ever loved? The office was quiet when I arrived that morning. My parents sat across from me, weary but resolute. The empire they had built, the one I had helped grow and then subtly dismantle, hung in the balance. For a moment, all the years of tension, betrayal, and ambition seemed to crystallize into a single point. The choice was mine. I leaned back, letting the weight of it settle. I could finish what I had started, take full control, leave them with nothing, and claim absolute victory. Or I could steer the wreckage back onto solid ground, salvage what remained, and perhaps, just perhaps, repair the bonds that had been fractured for so long. I spoke slowly, carefully. You made your choices. I made mine. But this doesn't have to be the end. My father's eyes flickered with disbelief. My mother's hands trembled, unsure whether to reach out or withdraw. My brother simply glared, a mixture of fear and anger simmering beneath his surface. I'll help stabilize the company, I continued, but on my terms. Things will change. You will have to acknowledge mistakes, redistribute responsibilities fairly, and trust competence over favoritism. If you can't, the company will fail, and that's on you. Silence followed. It was heavy, loaded with years of resentment, pride, and hurt. Finally, my father nodded reluctantly. My mother's eyes glistened, a silent admission of regret. My brother said nothing, but the defeat in his posture was unmistakable. The next months were grueling. I implemented changes that had long been overdue. Restructuring departments, reestablishing relationships with clients, retraining staff, and addressing the inefficiencies my parents had ignored. It was exhausting, often emotionally draining, but slowly, the company began to stabilize. And somewhere along the way, something unexpected happened. The tension in the family didn't vanish, but respect grew. My parents recognized my abilities, my brother grudgingly acknowledged his failings, and I began to understand that revenge, while satisfying, had come with a heavy price. It had forced me to confront not just their flaws, but my own capacity for calculation and ruthlessness. By the end of the year, the company was no longer on the brink. My parents had stepped back, humbled yet wiser. My brother was learning slowly to take responsibility. And I had gained more than control. I had gained clarity, perspective, and a hard-earned understanding of what it meant to balance ambition with conscience. I realized then that family, like business, required more than skill or loyalty. It required honesty, accountability, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. And for the first time in years, I felt a fragile sense of peace. The empire I had once loved, then watched crumble, had survived. But more importantly, I had survived too, changed, wiser, and painfully aware of the line between justice and vengeance. In the end, I hadn't just reclaimed recognition. I had reclaimed myself.